This is Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. The last time the U.S. government issued a draft call was December 7th, 1972. We were a different nation then, in a lot of ways. 50 years ago, we had a very different military, too. In 2023, most of the branches are struggling to meet their volunteer recruitment goals, and the Army, for the first time in recent history, actually fell short. Put aside for a moment how you feel about the U.S. military as an operation, and let's talk about recruitment. If the volunteer system no longer works, is it time for another draft?
We have the all-volunteer force presently. That's worked great for the military, and I think it's worked bad for America. All I'm asking people to do is really go back to the system that our country was founded on.
Joe Plenzler, consultant and Marine Corps veteran, joins us to share his idea for bringing back the draft in 2023.
And here's your prescription.
I know just the pharmacy to get this filled.
Who are you?
A pharmacy benefit manager. A middleman your insurer uses to decide which medicines you can get, what you pay, and sometimes even which pharmacy you should go to.
Why can't I go to a pharmacy in my neighborhood?
Because I make more money when you go to a pharmacy I own.
No one should stand between you and your medicine. Visit phrma.org/middleman to learn more. Paid for by Pharma.
Welcome back to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. The U.S. military is having trouble with recruitment. Last year, the Army fell short of its recruiting target by 15,000 soldiers. And this year, the shortfall is expected to be worse. Now, there are a lot of ideas about how to solve this problem. But the least popular of all is a draft. The American military has been all volunteer since the last man was inducted into the Army on June 30th of 1973. An Rasmussen survey from last year found fewer than 1 in 4 Americans is in favor of bringing the draft back, which means the vast majority of Americans do not want a draft. But there is a small but persistent minority of people, many of whom are veterans, who say a draft is our nation's best option. I'm not one of them. But this minority says not only could a draft help address shortfalls in military recruiting, it might change our perspective on what military service is, and it might change it for the better. Joe Plenzler is a consultant, lecturer, and retired Marine Corps officer, and he joins us now. Hello there.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Okay, so I think we're about to disagree.
Okay.
Respectfully.
Yeah, let's have the conversation.
But I think we can start off with some agreement, which is that before this, the all-volunteer model has worked well for the military. So why is the draft, to your mind, something that we need?
Well, in my view, I'm advocating for a hybrid system, right? Currently, we have the all-volunteer force presently. That's worked great for the military, and I think it's worked bad for America. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But throughout our history, all I'm asking people to do is really go back to the system that our country was founded on. Revolutionary War, we had conscription. You go to the Civil War, we had conscription. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, we had conscripted forces to serve in all those wars. And even things like, World War II, let's bust a myth right there. The greatest generation, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Germans were invading Europe, and all of a sudden all these patriotic Americans rushed off to war. Did they? 62% of Americans who served in World War II were drafted. So I'm just asking America to go back to a more fair and more democratic way of waging a war than the current all-voluntary force, right? And there's pros and cons to both. But I'm just asking America to go back to that, because I think if you look at it, we spent 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. We spent somewhere conservatively $3 trillion and literally $8 trillion on those campaigns. And the American people largely sleptwalked through 20 years of war, had absolutely shouldered 0% of the burden of that effort. And with deficit spending, we pushed that burden off on our kids. So, tell me how the all-volunteer force has worked well for America.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but conscription is the same as a draft. I mean, conscription literally means mandated, compulsory service.
That's correct.
Enlistment.
Yeah.
But we've never had equitable service in the military. Those who are wealthier, those who have political influence, have always been able to avoid military service. Going back to the Revolutionary War, military service has always fallen in a disproportionate way on especially the poor and the less powerful.
I would ask you to challenge your set of facts, where you're getting your information from on that. Like, who led the American Revolution?
What do you mean, who led the American Revolution?
It was the people who had the most at stake economically, right? George Washington, wealthy planner, right? Thomas Jefferson, wealthy planner. Benjamin Franklin, wealthy inventor. I mean, the people that led that war effort had the most to gain from it, right? Even Vietnam, there's a popular myth that during Vietnam, the war burden fell predominantly on less fortunate people. MIT did a study on that and looked quantitatively at that, and they found a very nominal difference in socioeconomic status about the people that served in Vietnam. So that was a 1992 study. You can look it up. It's pretty interesting.
So, I mean, very famously, the American Revolution was called a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
Every war has been called that.
Yes, but even going back, yes, there was a few wealthy merchants who put their support behind that. I mean, we're not here to argue history, and that helped the movement to gain momentum. But most of the wealthy in the American Revolution took no action at all. And going back to Vietnam, going simply by percentages, a large percentage is out of all proportion to the percentage that they make up of the American population were Black and brown soldiers. So,
well, let's challenge that as well. When you look at combat casualties in the Vietnam War, when you look at it, okay, so if you believe in the concept of race, the people who were identified as African American that served in Vietnam and died in that war, what percentage do you think of the total was that?
I would have no idea. I know that they were disproportionately sent to the front lines. I know that they were disproportionately disciplined and that they were disproportionately promoted less often. But my point I'm not saying
that the system's perfect, right? But like when you look at it, like who led desegregation in the United States? The American military.
I totally agree with that.
The military, right?
Totally agree.
Here's the point: because the system isn't perfect, should we throw the whole thing out? Right? The justice system's not perfect. Discrepancies everywhere throughout our history. Should we just like get rid of the legal system? No, we strive to make it better. Conscription has worked for our country in many ways and served in many ways as a melting pot of America, like a true melting pot where you bring people in from every single possible socioeconomic status and region of America, push them together, force them to operate as teams, and then to go back to their communities with expanded experiences based on working with people that they would have never met or worked with their entire lives and probably would have avoided. So, I think, when we do that, like, I think it is morally bankrupt to have a war, one, without Congress declaring war, two, without having a tax to pay for that war immediately, right? Like we've done in the past. And three, without having some form of conscription. Because other than that, like, you want to talk about like a poor man's army, who has the most economic incentive to go into the all volunteer force? It's not it's not the Ivy Leaguers. So I mean, we have a system that right now incentivizes the poorest of Americans to join.
Yeah, but that's also the case. Again, I have to go back to the fact that the draft also disproportionately affects the people in the bottom rungs of both income and power. Going back to the Vietnam War, which again was 1973 was the last time we had the last person inducted into the Army. So that's our last conflict. So if you go back to the Vietnam War, and this is a statistic I wrote down, the number of people who ended up being drafted dropped to only 23% among the richest. And that's because they all got deferments for one reason or another.
A lot of people volunteered because they knew their number was going to come up, right?
Right. But again, that number among the richest was only 23% at the height of the war. And it was significantly higher among people in the middle class and especially in the lower class. And that's because there's a number of different things that can get you out of the draft or conscription. And the people in the wealthiest families, the people who are who have political power or corporate power, are able to take advantage of those exceptions, and they do take advantage of them.
I think you and I are in complete agreement here. I don't think there should be exceptions to the draft. I think if you're in elected office in the United States, your kids probably should get a priority to be drafted first, right? Because then you're going to take our national defense so much more seriously. So I think you and I actually agree on this issue. Like, if we are going to have a draft,
Interesting.
there should be no exceptions. And we also ought to take a look at ability, right? Currently, the United States military doesn't allow so many talented people to join just because they have no use of their legs, right? Does it take use of your legs to fly a drone from an Air Force base in one of the Midwestern states? No. Does it take use of your legs to be a crypto analyst? No. Does it take use of your legs to be a cyber warrior? No. Right? There's so many jobs that people, we need to look at ability differently, from the military's perspective. Because right now, if you can't run 3 miles, do 20 pull-ups and 100 crunches in 2 minutes, you're not qualified, right? So that's a problem.
So this is really interesting. We're going to have to talk about this a little bit more. But first, we have to take a break. We are talking about whether or not we should bring back the draft. Joe Plenzler is with me. He will be with me still when we come back. You're listening to Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate, and we will return.
This episode is brought to you by Google. The Google Cybersecurity Certificate provides the necessary skills to begin a career in cybersecurity. Visit safety.google/cyber workforce today.
This episode is brought to you by Pete's. Few things start your day better than a good coffee. That's why Pete's hand roasts their coffee from a specific selection of high-quality beans. And they don't just put those beans into anyone's hands. Pete's trains their roasters for 10,000 hours so they can master the roast that gives you the most. Pete's Coffee. Coffee for coffee people. Find Pete's online or at your local retailer.
And we're back. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headlee, and we're talking about whether or not the solution to our military's recruitment problem is conscription. My opinion is no, but I'm willing to hear the argument from Joe Plenzler, a Marine Corps veteran, who says the all-volunteer Army, if I get this right, Joe, works for the military, does not work for America. And you just left with this very provocative statement, which would never make it to Congress, which is that the very people who vote to send us to war should be the ones who are sending their children, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I 100% believe that. Like, if you are serving as an elected official, at the federal level, and you have draftable kids, your kids should have a priority to be in our nation's military in a time of war, right? Because then you have skin in the game, literally. So I think, right, the problem is like when our Congress completely shucks their responsibility to actually declare war. When was the last declared war we had? Right? And so, when we don't even follow the Constitution to follow our own set of laws on how to go to war, and then with deficit spending, right, we spend trillions of dollars and shove it off into the future, onto our kids, right, to pay for. I mean, one of the reasons why do we have inflation today? Oh, we spent $3 to $8 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not right, right? And so, like, what deficit spending in the all-volunteer force allows the American people to do is sleepwalk through our foreign policy, pay no attention whatsoever to what the military is doing overseas, right? And do you think for a second that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan would have been allowed to persist for 20 years, if there had been draft on? Absolutely not. No way. It's what I'm advocating for is a hybrid system, right? Where our recruiters would go out and recruit for 11 months out of the year. And then what they don't make up, if they say I need to recruit 20 people and I recruited 18 by November, in December, we go to the selective service and spin that wheel and get the rest of them. Just like that.
Interesting. Okay, so that's what you mean by the hybrid system. So last year in 2022, the Army fell. All of the other military branches just made their targets. That's probably not going to happen in 2023. They probably will fall short. Yeah. But the Army fell 15,000 recruits short. So in your model, in December, they would then go and spin the wheel 15,000 times.
Yeah.
And recruit 15,000 members.
That's right.
And also in your model, the high up in that list would be the children of elected officials. Am I getting this all right?
Yeah. So like if you have one chance to do that, maybe they have a chance and a half or two chances, right? Maybe their name goes in twice. Yeah, I think that'd be compelling.
See, now, we may agree on this. Like, I absolutely, totally agree there. That if you are voting to send the nation to war, you need to be willing to send either yourself or your own kids.
That's right.
Not other people's children. Like we may have found a point of agreement here.
Mm-hmm. I love discourse. It's awesome.
I know. Yeah. And I want to go back to this idea where you were saying that you think the all volunteer force makes the military better.
Well,
because yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I said it works well for the military and bad for America, right? So it works well for the military in that, if we are, it's way easier. And I served at the Marine Corps West Coast boot camp for 2 years. I ran the drill instructor academy that makes the guys in the scary hats and shiny buckles that yell at recruits and administer that whole training process. But like, I will tell you, it is far easier to train a recruit, right, than it is, or a volunteer than it is a conscript, right? Somebody who wants to be there because for whatever reason they see their future and their set of values aligning with the military versus somebody who gets told, hey, I know you had plans, but guess what? You're not doing that anymore. You're coming into the military because we need you, right? So, one thing, you have a much more motivated person to begin with, right? Initially. But, the other thing too is when you look at the stories of people who were drafted in World War II, especially, their experiences of like, I would have never have considered military service until, my number came up and I had to go. And the things that they learned through that process about their fellow Americans, it really, truly is a melting pot. It's one of the few places in America where the pay scale is entirely transparent. Like everyone knows exactly what everyone else is making, right? There's no discrepancy between men and women in payment in the military. It's not there. Now you make an argument for promotion and retention and things like that. Sure. We still have some work to do for sure in that area. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to go off on a rabbit hole here if I'm not careful, but getting back to conscription, I think a hybrid model could really work because the system's in place already with the selective service. I think constitutionally, men and women, who are able-bodied and fit the criteria should be equally subject to the draft because we all enjoy the same benefits of citizenship and living in a free society. It's kind of like, it's interesting when you look at the training materials that our government provides to people who want to become American citizens, right? And they talk about rights and responsibilities. They'll enumerate, I think it's 6 or 7 rights, right? Freedom to express yourself, freedom to worship, freedom to vote, et cetera, et cetera. They enumerate 9 responsibilities. And that is the conversation we're not having in the United States. Everyone's talking about my rights, my rights, my rights, my rights. You don't see people arguing over my responsibilities to you as a citizen, right? To support and defend the Constitution, to stay informed of issues, to respect the beliefs and opinions of others, and defend the country should the need arise. It's what we tell people who want to come to this country. And it's kind of like, if we want to enjoy, America's not perfect, and it hasn't been perfect. I think we're striving to make it better. I think the arc of history is moving in the right direction, although it's challenged lately. But I think, compared to where we started, we're a lot better than when we were in 1776. We're not perfect. Got a long way to go. Yeah. But,
all that we can agree on. Yeah.
Right.
How about this, though? The fact is that with an all-volunteer army, you end up having people who stay in the military longer because they are volunteer and they make it a career. Whereas, I have read statistics that show there's really only 2 nations that have conscription that have truly high quality military, and they're both very small nations. That's Israel and South Korea. Well, so there's only 2 very small countries with very small populations that have both conscription and a high quality, well-trained military. Yeah. And because I've never served in the military, I wanted to make sure I did some research. The experts I was reading were saying, look, we can't recreate that in a country with the size of the population that we have. What about this idea that it with all volunteer, you're getting the top people, like you're getting a better quality of soldier?
But are we truly leveraging the breadth of talent in the United States if less than 0.5% of our country serves? I don't buy that argument. And I think, naturally, nobody wants to be told what to do. Nobody wants to be compelled by the state to take action, right? But we do it all the time, right? If you don't pay your taxes, you're going to get a call from the IRS. You're going to, if you disobey the law, you're going to get put in jail, right? So, our society compels behavior. And we've done this so many times throughout our nation's history when the national need arose, through a draft, conscription, call it what you will. It's just like, I get it. Nobody wants to be told what to do, but here's the other thing. I mean, we all have a responsibility to each other, right? If we're going to live in this country and we want to protect and defend our freedoms, there comes a point where we all are mutually responsible for our collective defense. So if I want to enjoy all the benefits of living in a free society, but I don't want to shoulder all the burdens of doing that, or at least some of them, what does that make me? What do we call people who want to enjoy all the rights, but not, shoulder any of the burden? It's just like everyone wants to exercise the right to vote, right? Or at least 51% of us do. How many people have volunteered to support your local elections as an election official?
All right, so we have to talk about so-called wokeism in just a moment.
Yeah.
But first, let's take a break.
Okay.
We're talking about whether or not we should bring back the draft in at least a limited way. Joe Plenzler says yes. And we're going to hear more about this in a moment. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. Stay with us.
And here's your prescription.
I know just the pharmacy to get this filled.
Who are you?
A pharmacy benefit manager. A middleman your insurer uses to decide which medicines you can get, what you pay, and sometimes even which pharmacy you should go to.
Why can't I go to a pharmacy in my neighborhood?
Because I make more money when you go to a pharmacy I own.
No one should stand between you and your medicine. Visit phrma.org/middleman to learn more. Paid for by Pharma.
I'm Josh Levine, the host of Slate's podcast 1 Year. In our new season, we're firing up our flux capacitors and taking you way back.
1955.
1955.
We'll bring you 1955's weirdest, wildest, and most captivating stories. You'll learn about forgotten pioneers, like the TV Weather Girls, who took the country by storm.
A cute, sexy young woman was very appealing, and I can quite understand why.
And you'll discover moments from the past that resonate deeply with the present, like how a bizarre conspiracy theory infected the nation's politics.
Oh my God, they're trying to establish a prison camp. This is going to be Siberia, USA.
1 Year, 1955. Out now, wherever you listen.
And we're back. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headley, and I'm here with Joe Plenzler, Marine Corps veteran, consultant, lecturer, many other things. And one of the things that he talks about is the need to bring back the draft in a limited way. The argument being, if one of the branches of the U.S. military misses its recruitment target, they should be allowed to use the selective service to get new recruits. So first, let's ask about whether or not then, if we're going to do that, we then start registering women. Do then women get included in selective service in your model, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And most of the women that I served with over 20 years in the Marine Corps at peace and in war would agree with that. They say, hey, listen, I'm a citizen just like a man. And if this system exists and citizens are expected to serve in a time of war, then all able-bodied citizens should be expected to serve in a time of war. And I think I wasn't the first to say that. In fact, my sisters in arms are the ones who were putting that forward, and I agree. It's just kind of like it's just like you're all in it or not. Because I think when you don't, what that allows, our system has been largely patriarchal for a long time, right? It allows that power structure to put women in a lesser status than the full-fledged citizen, right?
So, I mean, I agree with that entirely, but I'm sure you could not have served the length of time in the Marine Corps that you have without understanding that there's compatriots who don't agree with that, who believe there are areas of military service where women do not belong, where they are a liability.
Yeah, and my partner, my wife, she was served in the Marine Corps for 20 years as well, and fought against that very thing because the Marine Corps was saying, hey, women don't belong in the infantry, they don't belong in tanks, they don't belong in artillery. It's too dangerous. They put men at risk, and the data shows it just wasn't true. Right? They wanted to protect the all-male locker room essentially, and they wanted to discriminate against women based on their sex. We came along, and she went down to the Marine Corps' East Coast boot camp, uncovered 40 years of data showing gender bias in the recruiting and training of women, and addressed it internally, and then they fired her from her command. So, we, launched a pretty strenuous campaign with other people to get that policy changed, and the combat zone exclusion policy was removed within the Department of Defense. So now it's like, hey, if you can do the job, or you meet the qualifications, you have a right to compete for those jobs. Because, what are the fast tracks to leadership, especially within the Marine Corps? Ground combat arms, especially infantry, right? Out of all the commandants or the lead 4-star generals in the Marine Corps, one precisely in the entire history of the Corps was not infantry. So if you want to lead the organization, you got to get into that field. And, when they closed that to women, it was just kind of like, hey, all right, problem solved, right? So that was a big problem because it was unfair. And that was one policy I was really glad to see change.
So there are a number of things that the U.S. military, to give them credit, has been doing to try to make the military more welcoming to women in all levels of service. But you have a number of legislators and policymakers who are resisting that and trying to pass bills literally to make that harder.
Yeah.
And that would tend to make your proposal complicated, right? If they're trying to create ways so that you can send a woman to any state, to any base in the country or the world, then that means they can't have restrictions on service for all parts of their body, right?
Yeah.
But if you have legislators trying to legislate what kind of health care that a woman can receive for parts of their body, then you can't force them into the military because then their health care is threatened by military service.
And you're right. You bring up a good point, and it's exceptionally problematic. And when we look at the demographics and psychographics of the people who are advocating for that position, one thing becomes abundantly clear. It's not the women.
Yeah.
Right. And so what's funny is that this same crowd talks about my rights, my freedoms, and freedom this and freedom that, until somebody else expresses their right to freedom. They're like, oh, wait, don't be free like that. Don't have the freedom to make decisions for yourself about what you do with your own body. I mean, it is such an intellectually disingenuous and ridiculous proposition to say, we should be free to make decisions and be responsible in this country. And then we're going to tell women what they can and can't do with their own bodies. Like, to me, that's not freedom. That's something else that also begins with an F. And I can think of a couple words that match, right? So,
yeah. I mean, we'd have to solve that first.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of issues that are coming up in which we are seeing politicians, especially right now at this moment, trying to legislate and control what military leaders are able to do within the military in a way that I have not seen in the history of the United States before.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of it, I think part of the big problem is that over the last 4 to 6 years, politicians have generally accepted the fact that the military is best when it serves as a neutral party, right? We don't want military leaders deciding like what orders or not they're going to follow when the orders are lawful, right? We want them to salute smartly and carry out the national security plan. But the problem is when politicians start grabbing the military and using it as a cudgel to beat up their political opponents.
Yeah.
And to a degree, when prominent senior retired military leaders weigh into partisan politics, like Mike Flynn, that becomes an issue because the prestige that's held, that the American people have held for the military, is diminished. And we can quantitatively measure this. The Reagan Foundation, right? No liberal organization, found that public opinion of the military slid 14 points between 2018, I think, and 2021. And that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
One of the reasons, like when you have an all voluntary force and public opinion of military people and veterans, slides. And we know that veterans' recommendations to young people to join the military is one of the leading drivers of their volunteerism. When we lose that, that damages our national security, right? Under our current system. I mean, you want to talk about like, how do we go back to like a full draft? keep on, using the military as a political cudgel against your opponents. It's like I see politicians driving the country this way in opposite directions. I don't see enough, working to the center, coming to the center, compromising, collaborating, and working for the common good. I don't see it. I don't see it in Washington, and it's disappointing. It's disgusting. But here's the thing: like, we have an opportunity to do something as the American people about that because we choose our leaders. So ultimately, in many ways, we get the government we deserve as a country. We can do better. We need to do better. We've got to do better, right?
So we've found another issue on which we can fully agree with one another. So a point for us.
Yeah.
Let me bring up one other point, which is what's considered to be a universal basic human right, which is the freedom of labor, right? And that's expected to be, that you can't be forced into labor. And one could see conscription as forced labor. What's your response to that? That a draft, especially if it's not in a time of war, if it's just an attempt to make up recruitment numbers, is effectively a violation of that basic human right to freedom of labor.
Yeah, it's a good argument, and I'll tell you, I'm empathetic towards that idea, right? I'm an old punk rocker. I don't like being told what to do. If I take a values assessment, autonomy is off the charts. Like, I'm the guy who joined the military because I did not trust my government, right? And I was like, if our founding fathers, were like, hey, a standing army is the greatest threat to liberty, I believe it. I really do. And I think, because of that, good people need to be in our military to make decisions. So it's kind of counterintuitive how I came in, why I joined personally, but it was because I didn't trust the government. I wanted to be on the inside of the military, which is the most dangerous thing to our liberty in any country, right? You have a bunch of people with weapons who can compel through the use of force behavior. So those things need to be kept on really tight rails. We need good people in the military making those decisions. We need excellent leaders in Congress, which we don't have right now, providing oversight, right? Because we are a civilian-led government, a civilian-led military. Those are super important things. And I think, there's exceptions to every rule. And I would say, like, national security and our common defense is the exception to that rule, right? We would never, we've abolished forced labor in many places, in almost every place. You could make an argument in the prison industry, paying, incarcerated people pennies to do labor is another form of that, which I think probably needs to stop. But we don't have a country if we can't defend it, right? If we cannot protect ourselves, everything else doesn't matter. So, the military, like our system of voting, is a foundational bedrock thing that needs to exist below the level of politics and be administered below the level of politics. And I think for that only reason, because it's an existential thing, right? Like, I believe Thomas Hobbes when he said, a legitimate government needs to do two things. One, it needs to protect the people from attack. And two, it needs to punish the unjust. And any government that can't do those two fundamental things isn't a legitimate form of government. So, I think with the military, because our national security needs are so important, right, that we need to make an exception in this case because we cannot neglect it. When we do, really bad things happen. When we fail to engage around the world, really bad things happen. I mean, bad things happen when we do. It's a complicated, messy thing. But I think it's even though it's not a perfect system, it's a good system that needs good people to improve it.
I mean, I got to say, I came into this conversation expecting to disagree with everything that you said, and that has not turned out to be the case.
Good.
So kudos to you. You make a good argument. I'm not swayed on the core, but I got to say, I'm more convinced than I thought I would be. I will say that.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like when you actually have a conversation, I think most people agree on the goals. They disagree on the methods on getting them. I think most Americans are like me, like independent, centrist, want to see things done in a responsible way. But yeah, it's just like this hyper-partisan environment we find ourselves in. I mean, that's what will destroy us, right? More than anything. It's just like not any external threat or army. It's people who are unwilling to move to the center and work for the common good.
Okay, so I 100% agree with everything that you just said. So we can end on pure agreement. Okay, so because public opinion is so strong on hating the idea of a draft, I'm willing to bet you have an opinion on this idea. And you can easily share your opinion by emailing us. It's hearmeout@slate.com. A few weeks ago, we had Erin Tang on the show to argue that the Supreme Court's biggest problem is overconfidence. We knew that take would get people talking, and boy, did it. So before we go, we want to share a note we got from a listener named Dylan. Dylan wrote this: "Well, I think Erin Tang is right that overconfidence is the problem with the current court. I think he misattributes the root cause of that overconfidence. Originalism, as a jurisprudential philosophy, demands overconfidence of its practitioners, that they not only can but must disregard the opinion of all judges who came before them. Overconfidence was a problem before originalism, but the root cause of the overconfidence problem on the current court can be pretty directly attributed to the dominance of originalism as a jurisprudential philosophy." Thanks, Dylan. And also, Dylan, please say jurisprudential 3 times fast. Hear Me Out is a podcast from Slate. The show is produced by Maura Currie. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations, and Alicia Montgomery is VP of Slate Audio. I'm your host, Celeste Headlee. Until next time, speak your mind, but keep it open.